You're scrolling, and a Victorian parlor fills the screen. Candlelight, lace curtains. A woman in a fitted corset pouring tea into painted porcelain. Something in you settles. You want to live there, just for a second. That feeling is common enough that entire corners of the internet are built around it, entire aesthetics named after it. But if you had actually lived there, in an ordinary Victorian home, in that same room, you would likely be dead by your mid-40s, breathing air thick with coal smoke, and slowly being poisoned by the wallpaper on the wall behind her. That should sound like an exaggeration. It isn't. You already know the popular version of Victorian life. Elegant clothing, formal manners, ornate homes, gaslit streets, and grand architecture that still gets called timeless today. That version isn't fabricated. It's just radically incomplete, and the parts left out are exactly the parts that would have defined your day-to-day existence if you'd actually been born into it instead of just watching it through a screen 150 years later. Start with the exact aesthetic people are drawn to right now. That deep, saturated green you see in Victorian wallpaper, dresses, and even children's toys. Historian James C. Wharton documented the story behind that color in his book, The Arsenic Century, and it's more direct than most people expect. The pigment behind that beloved shade, known as Scheele's green, was manufactured using arsenic, not a trace contaminant left over from processing. A dye built directly on top of one of the most recognized poisons in human history. It was pasted onto nursery walls. It was woven into the fabric of dresses worn against bare skin for hours at a stretch. It turned up in candy coloring and in the paint on children's toys. And for decades, even as physicians began reporting headaches, nausea, and skin sores linked to arsenic-papered rooms, manufacturers and homeowners kept using it anyway, because no one could conclusively prove the wallpaper itself was the cause. And because, by every visual standard of the time, it looked beautiful. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it's the exact same standard driving the trend today. The color that's circulating in your feed right now as a symbol of elegance and calm is, historically speaking, the color of a slow-moving public health problem that took the better part of a century to fully take seriously. The wallpaper wasn't an isolated problem. It was a symptom of something much bigger. An era that looked ordered and refined on the surface, while understanding almost nothing about why the people living in it kept getting sick. In 1854, physician John Snow investigated a severe cholera outbreak, tearing through London's Soho district, killing dozens of people within days. At the time, the dominant medical theory, known as miasma theory, held that disease spread through bad air, drifting up from decaying matter. Snow did something unusual for the period. He mapped every recorded death by address and traced the cluster back to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. When the pump handle was removed, new cases dropped sharply. It's now taught as one of the founding moments of modern epidemiology. But here's the part that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. Snow's conclusions were met with resistance for years afterward. Most Victorian households kept drawing water from sources sitting dangerously close to their own waste well into the following decades, because germ theory itself wasn't widely accepted by mainstream medicine until later in the century. Victorians weren't careless. They were living inside a scientific framework that hadn't caught up to the danger surrounding them yet, and the gap between the danger and the understanding of it was measured in decades, not days. Historian Judith Flanders has spent much of her career reconstructing what ordinary Victorian domestic life actually looked like, day to day, inside homes far less grand than the ones usually shown on screen. Her research documents coal smoke so constant across cities like London that laundry hung indoors would turn visibly gray within hours. It documents overcrowding in working-class housing severe enough to put multiple families into single rooms with no real ventilation, and infectious disease moving through those conditions relentlessly, season after season. Life expectancy at birth across the period sat somewhere in the low 40s, though that number is misleading on its own, since it was dragged down heavily by infant and childhood mortality. If you made it to adulthood, you had a real shot at reaching your 60s or beyond. But getting there meant surviving a childhood defined by exactly the conditions Flanders documents: smoke-filled rooms, contaminated water, and diseases, modern medicine now prevents almost automatically. The elegant version of Victorian life you picture was, even at the time, a narrow slice of experience enjoyed by a wealthy minority. For most people actually living through the era, it was loud, filthy, and frequently short. Not everything modern audiences believe about Victorian hardship holds up under close inspection, though. And this is the part that adds real texture to the picture, instead of just flattening it into misery. Fashion historian Valerie Steele has spent years examining the specific claims around Victorian corsets, the fainting, the broken ribs, the crushed organs, and her research complicates the popular narrative considerably. Steele found that many of the most extreme corset injury claims were exaggerated at the time for moral and satirical reasons, and have been exaggerated further since, while actual measurements of surviving corsets and first-hand accounts suggest most Victorian women wore them snugly, not catastrophically. Tight lacing extreme enough to cause organ damage was the exception, not the daily norm. The corset wasn't harmless. It restricted movement and breathing to a real degree. But it wasn't the medical horror story it's often flattened into either. Even the parts of Victorian life that get correctly identified as bad are frequently misremembered in the wrong direction, which tells you something important about how thoroughly this era has been rewritten after the fact. In both directions, at once. Here's the twist that should actually change how you think about all of this. None of the real hardship was hidden from Victorians themselves. They didn't consider their own moment beautiful and serene the way modern aesthetic videos frame it now. Contemporary doctors, journalists, and social reformers at the time were the ones publicly complaining, loudly and repeatedly, about the smoke, the smell, the arsenic, and the disease. The romantic, softly lit version of the era isn't something Victorians believed about themselves while they were living it. It's something built afterward, using only the objects that happened to survive. The ornate furniture, the preserved dresses, the grand facades, none of which include the smoke, the smell, or the untreated illness that also define the period just as completely. There's a real documented psychological mechanism behind why this keeps happening, and it isn't unique to the Victorians at all. Psychologist Terence Mitchell ran a series of studies in the 1990s, tracking how people remembered experiences like vacations over time, comparing how they rated the experience while it was happening against how they remembered it weeks later. He found a consistent pattern. People rated past experiences more positively in memory than they had rated them in the moment, a distortion now known as Rosy retrospection. Your brain doesn't file away a complete balanced record of an experience. It quietly edits out friction as time passes and keeps the parts that hold up best in hindsight. Apply that same editing process to an entire historical era, using only its surviving art, architecture, and fashion as the remaining record, and you get exactly what's circulating in your feed right now, a highlight reel mistaken for a lived reality. Here's where this stops being history and starts being about you, scrolling through your phone right now. The pull you feel toward that candlelit parlor isn't a pull toward 1870. It's your own rosy retrospection running on inherited images instead of a memory you actually lived through, quietly editing out the coal smoke, the arsenic, and the fact that a headache in that beautiful green room might have been the first sign something in the walls was slowly poisoning the person sitting in it. The aesthetic survived, carefully, in paint and fabric and photographs. The daily reality mostly didn't, because nobody thought to preserve the smell, the smoke, or the fear of a water pump 2 streets over. So the next time a Victorian parlor fills your screen, candlelight, lace curtains, a woman in a fitted corset pouring tea, you can still find it beautiful. Just know you're looking at a highlight reel your own brain would build out of any era handed to it, applied backward onto one that, for almost everyone actually living inside it, was shorter, sicker, and far less serene than it looks from exactly here.